Well, 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 well. It seems that we've gotten into a slew of crises as a country in the past week. Where do I begin? Well, let's see. There was Trump's press conference celebrating the first anniversary of the Trump restoration, which was a complete disaster. And then there was his speech at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, which wasn't even that good. And his remarks in Davos came in response to and in the wake of Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney's speech explaining that the old order that was established over 8 decades ago by Franklin Roosevelt and continued by Harry Truman and most of his successors and other leaders in the West, that order is over. And in this new order, the United States, Russia, and China are predator nations that lesser powers like Canada and the Western European countries have to watch out for. Splendid. And just when you think it can't get any worse, look what happened today in Minneapolis with the shooting of that intensive care unit nurse by immigration and customs enforcement agents. An ICU man shot to death 11 times by ICE men. And he was 37, just like Renee Nicole Good. That's an eerie coincidence. If you hear meowing, that's my cat, Claudia. Well, this is where we are as a nation, folks. I don't think Trump has to give a State of the Union address to explain what the State of the Union is, because I think we know what state it's in. Isn't it obvious that this country is falling apart? I wanted to see this country break up into smaller countries. And quite frankly, I still do. But I was thinking maybe New Jersey could be the first state to secede from the Union and then start a chain reaction among the other Democratic Party run states that would force a conference that would lead to a negotiated national divorce. That's what I wanted to see. I've made a slight change to that. I want to see Minnesota become the first Democratic state to secede from the Union. This is my cat, Claudia. Isn't she cute? And of course, she has to bother me at this very moment. Cutie. Say hello to our YouTube viewers, Claudia. Leave hello. Maybe I should have gotten Shorty instead, because he's only a stuffed kitten. Anyway, I've written about most of this on my blog at stephenmcginnis.blogspot.com. So you can read about all the gory details there. But there's one thing I haven't written about yet, at the time of making this video, and that's Pam Bondi telling Governor Tim Walz of Minnesota that she'll gladly have ICE agents withdrawn from Minneapolis and from other locales across Minnesota on one condition. She has to be provided, Tim Walz has to provide her, Pam Bondi, the Attorney General, the state's voter rolls. And you want to know why she wants the voter rolls of Minnesota? So that when Minnesotans go to the polls in November and elect a new governor and a new senator, the federal government can insist that there was fraud based on what they see in the voter rolls. Ladies and gentlemen, Pamela Jo Bondi, the top law enforcement officer in the nation. It's so obvious that she's trying to blackmail Governor Walz that anybody with half a brain can figure it out. And that's probably why so many MAGA Republicans are now beginning to turn against Trump. Pam, honey, maybe this job isn't cut out for you. This whole Attorney General thing. Maybe you should go back to school and find the job that fits your unique talents. Clown school. Well, based on everything that's happened in the past week and based on everything I fear is going to happen in the coming week, what with another government shutdown possible, and seeing as how everything is running off the rails, I am more committed than ever to advocating for the breakup of the United States of America. And I don't even care which Democratic state secedes first. Minnesota, New Jersey, New York. It only takes one to get the ball rolling. Of course, if California became the first Democratic-led state to secede, then the whole union would unravel like that. But Gavin Newsom isn't going to get California to secede. He's not going to lead the charge. He thinks this country can still be saved. And for the same reason, Illinois won't be the first Democratic-led state to secede either. J.B. Pritzker also thinks this country can be saved. One Democratic-led state that would certainly be the canary in the coal mine if it became the first state to secede would be Pennsylvania. Why? Because Pennsylvania is a swing state. It went for Trump 2 times out of 3. And Josh Shapiro is as unlikely to advocate for secession as Gavin Newsom and J.B. Pritzker are. But if Shapiro suddenly did come out and advocate for secession, and if he led the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania out of the Union before any other Democratic state, that would be significant simply because he is very popular in a state that can go either way in presidential elections, and he's just as committed to helping to get the country through what we're going through right now as Newsom and Pritzker are. So that would really be something if Shapiro advocated for Pennsylvania to secede. As for our new governor in New Jersey, Rebecca M. Sherrill, who calls herself Mikey, the woman is 53, 54, and she's still going by a cutesy pie little girl name. When she starts calling herself Rebecca, then I'll know she's serious about doing something to pull New Jersey out of the Union. Because secession is no job for a governor with a little girl named like Mikey. It's the job for a woman named Rebecca, because this is serious stuff. Well, I know breaking up the country is hard. I know that even if one or two states led by a Democratic governor were to secede from the Union in response to everything Trump has done in the past year, and especially the past week, it wouldn't necessarily trigger a mass exodus of states that would in turn require a conference not unlike the one that was held in Washington in early 1861 before Abraham Lincoln took office as President of the United States. The kind of conference that would manage a national divorce through negotiations. But I guess it's worth a shot, right? The difficulties of going through such a process are seemingly insurmountable, but not necessarily so. Of course, there are people who say it could never happen. I'm going to reprise what Mary Trump said almost a year ago. It was April 2025, in response to my question to her during one of her live YouTube appearances about how she felt about breaking up the United States. And once again, here it is.
Stephen, question. How do you feel about breaking up the union to smaller countries, Mary? Well, that's interesting. I think we should. I just don't think it's possible. One of the very, very first times, I was interviewed by Molly Jong-Fast. I honestly, it was in advance of the 2020 election. I don't even remember what we were talking about, but she said, it's so obvious that America is really 5 countries. It should be 5 completely separate countries. It's too big. It's too, the ways in which the regions are different are too jarring. We cannot be a cohesive whole under the especially not with the kind of government we have now. I'm saying that. So it's a shame actually in some ways that we didn't figure that out sooner, because it's very difficult to see how this all hangs together. But then there are problems, right? Let's say, and I'm not saying this is going to happen. I think it's highly unlikely that anything like this would happen. But let's say Texas decided to secede from the Union because, well, just a bunch of woke liberal idiots. Well, there are a lot of people in Texas who are also woke liberal idiots and would rather be in the same country with New York and California than Texas. So what do we do? Just leave them? It's like the same dilemma. I mean, not to the same degree, obviously, but the Civil War. Like, well, do you just let the South secede? Well, no, because there are millions of enslaved people. We can't just leave them, knowing what's going to happen to them. So you fight a Civil War. We allegedly won the Civil War, and then the fucking North lost the Civil War all over again. So we just don't know how to do things properly. And I don't know how this plays out, but nothing. Yeah, I mean, I guess the simplest way to put it is none of our options, even good ones, seem viable, and that's a very problematic place to be. So let's just focus on getting out of this particularly horrific situation we're in right now. I think is the way to go about it, and then we'll just see how things are when we get there.
Shorty's joining us. I love this little guy. He knows a thing or two about how to stand up to bullies like Donald Trump. Remember, this bulldog was torturing and tormenting him. And so a black cat helped him out by crossing the bulldog's path to give him bad luck. But then the bulldog painted the cat white. So Shorty painted himself black to help his fellow feline out and cross the bulldog's path as a black kitten so the bulldog wouldn't beat up the black cat he painted white. And boy, did he get what he deserved. I love this little guy. He's sort of like my mascot for how to stand up to bullies like Donald Trump. So anyway, those comments Mary Trump made are from April 2025, and I include them in my first video about breaking up the country into smaller countries. And I remember she mentioned Molly John Fast, who said that we're really 5 countries. Well, no, as I already indicated in my first video on the subject, we're more like 10 or 12 countries. And I ought to show you the revised version of the map I made a year ago for how I think the country should be broken up. I've used the revised map as a thumbnail on one of my more recent videos on the subject of secession and dissolution of the Union, but I think I ought to show it to you more properly in this video. Okay, as you can see, I've taken West Virginia out of the Midwestern Republic of Heartland that I created and put it into the Middle Atlantic Republic of Lenape that I created because West Virginia is really more of a Middle Atlantic state. After all, it was culled from Virginia, and it really has more in common with Virginia and the other Middle Atlantic states than it has in common with the states of the Midwest. Admittedly, West Virginia's politics are far more conservative than the politics of the other 6 Middle Atlantic states, but any political differences between West Virginia and the other 6 states in the Middle Atlantic region that would become this country called Lenape would probably work themselves out. Now, out west, I eliminated the country of Grand Colorado, which was Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, New Mexico, and Arizona, because the former three states have much more in common with each other than with the latter two states. Montana, Wyoming, and Colorado are mostly mountains and grassland, whereas Arizona and New Mexico are mostly desert. And geography and topography shape a culture and a people far more than race and ethnicity. So I put Montana, Wyoming, and Colorado in heartland, and I combined Arizona and New Mexico into a single country, also called New Mexico, because when the New Mexico Territory was first created in 1850, it included all of present-day Arizona. So it just made more sense to make those two states one country and to add the other three to Heartland. And as you can see, I also redrew the western borders of Wyoming and Colorado. It simply made more sense to draw the western borders of both states down the spine of the Rocky Mountains, which is the Continental Divide, and give the present day western areas of both states to the Mormon state of Deseret. Because the straight lines that Congress created when they created these states as territories defy geographical reality. You look at a map of Europe, you see how many countries are divided by mountain ranges. So this made far more sense. Montana, of course, already has a western border along the Rocky Mountains. So that's fine. And that's pretty much all I did. Okay, so Mary Trump, back in April 2025, did cite some obvious problems. She brought up, for example, the theoretical secession of Texas. If Texas were to secede from the Union to get away from all those so-called liberal idiots in other parts of the country, there would be so-called liberal idiots in Texas like Jasmine Crockett and James Talarico who would be politically ostracized in an independent Texas dominated by right-wingers. One idea I envisioned would be that during the negotiated national divorce, perhaps for a set period of 6 months, a year, maybe a year and a half, people in one part of the country that's about to become part of a new nation would be allowed to move to another part of the country that's about to become a separate nation, so they would feel more welcome and more comfortable. The only problem is that if we arranged for a program like that, we'd end up with 10 or 12 different countries in which people of the same political persuasion would all be clustered together, and there wouldn't be much of a chance for two-party politics in any of these countries. Also, there are the cultural differences to consider. I mean, down south, people take things much more slowly than us uptight Northeasterners. And so, could you imagine somebody from the South, let's say a white family from Mississippi or Alabama, who are politically liberal and feel outnumbered where they live, moving up to the greater New York City area, where everybody is really tense and uptight and on edge? How would this Southern white liberal family feel living in an area where the only thing they have in common with people is that they're liberals? Where everybody is brash, maybe a little crude, and very intense, whereas a white liberal family from the South would be more genteel, more polite. The culture shock would be really bad. So, what I imagine we'd have to do is maybe preserve some sort of international union between the former parts of the United States. Maybe a North American union, like the European Union, that would have a common currency and allow people to travel to different parts of the former United States without fuss or muss. So, an aspiring actor from Idaho or an aspiring ballet dancer from Wyoming could move to New York City or Los Angeles or whatever without needing a passport or visas or something like that. But then there are other problems. You see, the European Union was created by a treaty, and the pact that the European Union operates under has several rules and codes. For example, the European Union bans capital punishment in its member nations. Could you imagine a North American Union banning capital punishment? A revived Confederate States and a restored Republic of Texas would never join a union like that. So those are things that have to be considered, obviously. But these are just ideas I'm tossing out. Part of the beauty of a negotiated national divorce is that things like that will be sorted out through negotiations. And eventually, we cut some kind of a deal prior to the final separation. Because I don't know. I don't think Jasmine Crockett, for example, would be welcome in California or New York. She might be welcome in New Jersey because that gal has some lip. We're known for that in New Jersey. But she's probably too much of a Southern girl to ever integrate fully into a country carved out of the Northeast or of the West Coast. Look, all I know is that something has to be done, and it must involve breaking up the country. Even Mary Trump said that we should. And as you know, Molly John Fast says that we're at least 5 different countries, though I would say we're more like 10 or 12. And you'll notice in my map that I made Texas, Florida, Alaska, and Hawaii countries unto themselves. Texas and Hawaii used to be countries unto themselves, and Alaska and Florida were colonies of other countries that we acquired through purchase in the case of Alaska and negotiation in the case of Florida. See, here's the deal. Right now, things are untenable. Trump has completely demolished the federal government. He's emaciated the Department of Health and Human Services and the Centers for Disease Control with the cooperation of HHS Secretary Robert Kennedy Jr. Elon Musk may be long gone now, but he did a lot of damage to the bureaucracy with his so-called Department of Governmental Efficiency. And Congress is acting like a rubber stamp legislature, like the Reichstag in Nazi Germany or the Supreme Soviet of the USSR. For much of 2025, Congress wasn't even in session that much. Why do you think Mikey Sherrill left to become governor of New Jersey? Why do you think Amy Klobuchar is playing the run for governor of Minnesota now? Because they think they can do more in their home states than they can representing us in Washington. I remember when a governor would move up to the Senate. It was considered a promotion to go from your state capital to Washington, D.C. Now it's the other way around. We had a governor in New Jersey, John Corzine, who left the Senate to become a governor because, like Amy Klobuchar, he realized that he couldn't do much as a senator for his state. Also, Trump has ruined our relations with every country in the world. The Canadians signed a trade agreement with China. The Europeans are considering dumping U.S. Treasury bonds and retaliating against the tariffs Trump initiated. They can't trust the United States anymore. And not just because Trump demanded the acquisition of Greenland. You see, after January 6th, it was the U.S.'s responsibility to punish Trump, put him in jail, make sure he could never run for president again, and move on from there. We skipped all that and went to the move on part Bad idea. Merrick Garland did nothing to make sure that Trump couldn't run for president again. Jack Smith was appointed too late as special prosecutor to be very effective, and even though he hit the ground running, pretty soon he hit the ground, period, because of Trump's lawyers and also because of a sympathetic judge down in Florida. He pursued two airtight cases, but he couldn't get past the legal maneuvers that Trump employed, and he couldn't get past the Trump sympathetic judge, Aileen Cannon, down in Florida. And the final insult to the rest of the world came when, in spite of everything the voters knew about Trump, enough of them decided to put him back in office anyway. And in the days after the election, I remember Donnie Deutsch and Chris Matthews were on MSNBC, and Chris Matthews scolded the Democrats for failing to understand the average voter. And Donnie Deutsch had no sympathy for the Democrats at all. He was laughing at them. And in fact, the Democrats, under normal circumstances, would have deserved a tongue lashing from Chris Matthews and a good hearty laugh from Donnie Deutsch, because Kamala Harris ran the sort of campaign that was too cautious and not bold enough, and that's not the sort of campaign that attracts swing voters. That, however, should not have been the source of the interpretation Chris Matthews and Donnie Deutsch came to in the aftermath of the 2024 election. In other words, they shouldn't have looked at that. What they should have done is ask themselves why people voted for Trump. Yes, Harris ran a lousy campaign in the end, and much of her campaign was burdened by the fact that she got into the election campaign quite late. But still, she had an opponent that everyone knew was a crook. One of the 4 cases against him did go to court, and he was convicted on 34 counts. So he was a convicted felon. We all saw what happened on January 6th. The Democrats should have been able to nominate a houseplant and defeated him. But the voters said no. In spite of everything Trump did, they still trusted him more than Harris or possibly any other Democrat. The United States was not alone in throwing out the incumbent in Western countries because of the sluggish post-COVID economy. That, however, should not have been our prerogative. Other countries could vote out incumbent parties because the opposition wasn't lawless. The British threw out the Tories in favor of Labour, but they were able to do that because Keir Starmer was not a crook and he was not a convicted felon. We didn't have that discretion. Once Trump was nominated again by the Republicans, we should have rejected him no matter how lackluster a candidate Kamala Harris was. But we didn't. And even though Harris lost for reasons that were not of her making, the fact that she lost for reasons that were of her making were, I'm sorry to say, enough to ensure that she will never be elected president. She will never be allowed to make a comeback like Trump did, and she will never be nominated again by the Democratic Party to run for president, because Democrats aren't so forgiving. The people of the world could see what we could see, that Trump deserved to be in prison, not in the White House. And yet we put him back in the White House. They're mad at us, not just Trump. They think the United States is a failed country. And quite frankly, I agree, which again is why we should break up the country into 12 separate countries, as I've mapped out, and adapt to the new world order that Trump has created. Some of these 12 new countries that I've mapped out can join NATO. I imagine an independent New England and a Midwestern or Middle Atlantic republic would be part of NATO. So would a Pacific Northwest republic, Washington State and Oregon. So would California. And independent California, as I've indicated on my map, would include Nevada. A revived Confederacy and a restored Republic of Texas likely would not. Neither would an independent Florida. By the way, I think Florida should become a monarchy and crown Trump King Donald I. Donald Jr. can become King Donald II when his time comes. Trump is already acting like a king. His adopted home state should crown him once it becomes an independent country. And obviously, New England, a middle Atlantic country, and maybe even a Midwestern country would re-enter the Paris Agreement. Hell, the Mormon state of Deseret would probably do that. But obviously, a revived Confederate States and a restored Republic of Texas would not. And certainly, a Kingdom of Florida wouldn't. But Florida's probably going to sink into the ocean one of these days anyway. So, yeah, it's going to be messy breaking up the country, but I think we can do it in a way that would avoid a civil war, although Minnesota is kind of fighting a civil war now. Minnesota is at war with the U.S. government. But here's my idea. A few Democratic states will secede. Doesn't matter which state is first, New Jersey, Minnesota, Connecticut. But as soon as one or two Democratic states secede, the other Democratic states will follow. And that will force a conference to break up the entire country. To those who say that Trump will respond militarily, yet every time Trump threatens something, he eventually pulls back. Trump always chickens out. In fact, when such a conference to break up the Union peacefully is started, we should have a taco dinner. How symbolic. Well, I guess that's it. I'm not going to recite my sample ordinance of secession for my home state. But just to let you know, I revised the sample ordinance to apply to Minnesota, and I wrote Governor Walz urging that he pull his state out of the Union and send him a sample ordinance for Minnesota's secession. I only made a few changes. One change reflecting what's going on now. I'm not going to recite that either. But not only did I write Governor Sherrill urging that she pulled New Jersey out of the Union, I also wrote the Speaker of the New Jersey State Assembly and the New Jersey State Senate President, urging them to go along with it. So I'm pretty serious about this. Every Sunday, during the weekly protest in a town near mine, I would participate, and halfway through the allotted hour of protest, I would get on a planter. This town has a raised garden bed with a wall. I would get on top of the wall and read my sample ordinance and conclude by saying, "Ladies and gentlemen, the Union is dissolved," like I've done with some of my other videos here. When the weather gets warmer, I'm certainly going to do that again. So I'm all in. I'm all in on secession. I'm all in about dissolving the Union, not just between New Jersey and the rest of the country, but the entire Union. So I'm going to keep doing this, and I'm going to be back in one way or another with another video on the subject. So I better get off my soapbox. Shorty here is telling me I've said enough. Yeah, I've said enough. So I'll see you again next time.